Americans are constantly hearing about one economic crisis after another, right? A housing crisis, a cost of living crisis, a massive debt crisis. And usually they're talked about like they're totally separate issues. But if we really want to get what's going on, we have to look at the invisible architecture beneath it all. In this explainer, we're going to look at how policy and power literally shape the economic reality for the 99%. Because the system was not broken, it was built this way. For working families, these crises, they're absolutely not separate. The person struggling to pay rising rent is often the exact same person carrying a mountain of student debt, working without reliable benefits, and putting expensive groceries on a credit card just to get by. Or think about a small business owner fighting for financing while trying to compete against a massive corporation. These pressures are all deeply connected. People are just getting squeezed from every direction all at once. Now, society frequently tells us that these struggles are just millions of unrelated personal failures. But are they? Today, we're going to explore a major paradigm shift. What if these widespread hardships aren't individual mistakes at all? What if they're the direct result of an economic system doing exactly what it was built to do? Determining who gets opportunity, who carries the risk, and who actually has the power to make the rules. Let's get right into Section 1, how systems are built and how policy becomes reality. When we say the system was built this way, we don't mean there's some secret mastermind pulling all the strings. It's just that the system developed organically over generations through very specific intentional choices. Think of policy as the rules of the game. Congress sets the minimum wage, local governments decide zoning laws, regulators set lending standards, and tax laws decide who gets a break. None of these are laws of nature. They're just rules created by people, dictating the playing field. And over time, those rules become structure, and that structure becomes our daily reality. Once a rule has been around for decades, it starts to feel inevitable. We completely forget that another choice could have been made. And often, this invisible architecture ends up protecting the folks who already have money and influence while leaving ordinary families totally exposed. Which brings us to Section 2, housing and historical exclusion, and the generational impact of policy. Housing is probably the clearest historical example of how a system can build immense wealth for some while actively excluding others. After World War II, the GI Bill helped create one of the biggest middle-class wealth expansions in American history. It helped millions of veterans buy homes. But access wasn't equal. Because of redlining, which was a heavily institutionalized practice back then, Black veterans were largely denied access to those same wealth-building mortgages. They faced systemic barriers that overwhelmingly blocked them from the growing suburbs. And being locked out of homeownership back then, it didn't just mean missing out on a house. If a family bought a home in 1950, they could use that equity to pay for a kid's college, start a business, or leave an inheritance. So exclusion literally meant losing decades of financial leverage and intergenerational wealth. That's a perfect example of how a past policy choice continues to shape reality today. Moving on to Section 3, the wealth concentration gap, and who holds the assets. We can literally see how those historical choices have piled up into today's staggering wealth gaps. The scale of this concentration is just massive. To put this into perspective, let's look at some data from the Federal Reserve for the first quarter of 2026. The wealthiest 10% of households held nearly 68% of all household wealth. Meanwhile, the entire bottom half of households, literally half the country, shared just 2.5% of the total wealth. That is a huge disparity. Extreme concentration like that doesn't just happen because some people worked harder. It happens because wealth multiplies through owning assets that appreciate in value, like houses, stocks, and businesses. But if you're spending every dime on rent, food, and debt, you simply can't buy into those assets. The system highly rewards ownership, which means we're playing a game where the starting line has just never been even. Let's look at Section 4, workers, wages, and rent, the squeeze on the 99%. There is a massive disconnect right now between the immense value workers produce and what they actually take home. Between 1979 and 2025, net worker productivity went up by over 92%. Workers are producing nearly double the value per hour, but typical worker pay, that only went up about 34%. So why weren't those gains shared equally? Well, a big part of it is a systemic drop in bargaining power. Union membership fell from over 20% in the early 80s to roughly 10% in 2025. When workers have to negotiate all by themselves, employers hold all the leverage. And that brings us to a really stark reality about the rules we choose not to update. The federal minimum wage has been stuck at $7.25 an hour since 2009. If you work 40 hours a week every single week of the year at that rate, your gross income is barely over $15,000. But in 2024, the national median gross rent was almost $18,000. A full year of minimum wage earnings literally doesn't even cover a single year of median rent. Letting the wage floor just sit there while costs skyrocket, that is a systemic policy decision. Section 5. Beyond personal blame. Examining the rules. One of the wildest things about this unequal system is how it messes with us psychologically. Society essentially trains us to view these structural outcomes purely as individual failures. We hear it all the time, right? Budget better, work harder, read the fine print. And hey, personal financial responsibility is absolutely important. We should all try to make smart choices. But you simply cannot out-budget a structural deficit. A good budget might help you survive a tough spot, but it doesn't fix the structure that put you in that spot to begin with. Just look at the numbers. In 2023, nearly half, 49.7%, of all U.S. renter households spent more than a third of their income on housing. When half of all renters are handing over that much of their paycheck just for a roof over their heads, it is mathematically impossible for that to be millions of isolated budgeting mistakes. Personal choices definitely matter, but when economic hardship is this widespread and this predictable across the 99%, we really need to stop blaming individuals. A pattern that repeats this much points directly to the system. It's time to start examining the rules. Section 6. Following Power and Money. A framework for accountability. So, once you understand these systems, how do you evaluate them moving forward? Well, we need an accountability checklist to look past all the political slogans. We have to ask the hard questions. Who actually writes the laws? Who gets the loopholes and the exemptions? Who owns the assets and who has the influence? True accountability means looking at who gets the protections and who is left carrying the bag. You know, the economic system isn't failing everyone. It's creating massive wealth, amazing technological progress, and record corporate profits. But it really boils down to this. The economy creates wealth, sure, but who actually benefits from it and who is forced to pay the cost? Inequality isn't an accident. It's built over time through policy and power. But honestly, there's a really empowering takeaway here. Because the system was built by choices about labor, housing, and credit, it can absolutely be rebuilt with different ones. Past policies created today's reality, which means different policies can create a better tomorrow. Thanks for joining me for this explainer. Remember, understanding the system always begins with following the money. Be sure to subscribe for our next explainer, where we'll be diving into corruption in plain sight to see exactly how lobbying and corporate influence shape public policy. Read more at the 99% Perspective, and I'll see you next time.